In this video on how to construct the SumoBot, I want to go over the first upgrade with you. We're going to go from standard 3mm LEDs to surface mount components consisting of the surface mount LED and the surface mount resistor. So the upgrade consists of a small printed circuit board that we need to cut to size, and we need to tin it and drill it to accept this set of header pins that's going to connect our surface mount board to our main printed circuit board. Our resistors come in a little package with a clear plastic covering on them. So when you take the plastic covering off, be careful because these little guys will fly all over the place. These are our surface mount LEDs. They're actually blue in color when they're energized. They're actually gull-winged LEDs, and they come in a little plastic package with a plastic covering over them, so when you take the plastic covering off, they have a tendency to pop all over the place too. So be very careful because these are hard to find should you drop them on the floor. This is our original SumoBot, and originally we placed all the LEDs on the top, and the LEDs tell you what the SumoBot does, so it seemed like a good idea at the time. Then the professor who was teaching the course thought that we should get into some surface mount components. So what we did was we upgraded our SumoBot to have this surface mount board with surface mount LEDs and surface mount resistors. Now originally the board was going to be mounted on the top here, but then I realized that there was a fair amount of space underneath here where the motors go, and it would look a lot cooler if the surface mount LEDs were placed right in the chassis of the SumoBot. So that's what we're going to look at today. Now this upgrade comes with a little printed circuit board. Now we're going to have to drill some holes in the bottom here, but where we place the surface mount components there are no holes drilled, but we're going to use this little 90-degree header strip, and what we're going to do is we're going to mount that in the bottom holes. So the bottom holes have to be drilled at 1/32 each, and then just kind of opened up a little bit because these header pins are actually square, and square pegs don't really fit in a round hole very well, so you're going to have to enlarge those little holes just a little bit. Now you can see that we've got some pads that are spaced further apart and some that are closer together. The ones that are closer together are for resistors, and the ones that are further apart are going to be for the surface mount LEDs. The surface mount resistors come in this little piece of cardboard that has a plastic window on it. So to get them out, this is the resistor right inside here. So to get them out, you have to take the plastic off, and when you're doing that, they're going to have a tendency to bounce around. You're going to drop them all over the place. So you might want to do it on a piece of paper. These resistors are black, so if you use a white piece of paper, you can see where you drop each of them. And similarly for the LEDs, these little surface mount LEDs, they're actually gull-wing LEDs because I thought they'd be a little easier to mount on the board. And you can see that they're kind of a wider device, and they're in these little plastic containers here, and they kind of rattle around in there. Okay, and it has a little plastic coating on there too, so when you take that off, they have a tendency to jump all over the place. And if you drop them on the floor, I mean, it's going to be really hard to find them, so you might want to open them up in a little tray or a bag or something so that you can find them afterwards. So here's a SumoBot I'm working on. So I've trimmed my little printed circuit board so it fits inside that opening. And what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to take off all of these LEDs that are mounted on here. And this little printed circuit board, you'll have to orient it right, is going to go in there. And this set of header pins, right, the short legs are going to have to go into the board from behind, and then they will go into where the LEDs were originally placed on your main circuit board. It's interesting to note that surface mount parts are going to go on the front of the board, and the header strip, which is already pre-bent at 90 degrees, is going to go on the back of the board and come through and be soldered on like a standard through-hole component. But the surface mount parts are going to be on the front of the board rather than the back of the board. So a little bit different thinking here. So having trimmed my board to the correct size, which is basically the outline trace that I put all the way around the board to make it easy for you to trim it to size, the next thing is you've got to deoxidize the board so that the solder will stick to it when we tin it. So use a little steel wool, and remember to take your fingers off the edges, because if you put your fingers on the edges, you're putting a layer of grease on the board, and then the solder won't stick to it. So give it a really good scrubbing. So once you've got it nice and shiny, just go over it with a little brush or something, just to get the little pieces of steel wool off, because if they're on there when you tin the board, it will short all the little traces together. So just brush it off. If you don't have a brush, you can use some paper towel. So the next thing we're going to do is apply some flux on here. I've put it on a piece of paper towel because it is a small board and I don't want to get flux all over the place, and it's kind of sticky, so I don't really want it on my fingers. Just kind of holding it down with my fingernail there. So make sure you get it all over the board. Then we're going to come in with our soldering iron. So I'm just going to use my regular pointy nose tip, just bringing a little bit of solder on there, and then I'm going to go over and just tin the board here. So the first one, it's going to go on kind of thick, and then after that you can just kind of move it around. It's a little bit harder with the pointy tip, but I'm going to need the pointy tip when I put the parts in, so I was too lazy to change it. So now the board's going to get very hot when you're doing this, so you might want to give it a chance to cool off. Ouch. And then come back in here and pick up some solder from some of these spots. Bring it back here. And don't forget every so often to go along, clean your tip on your sponge. Add a little bit of fresh solder. And then just come down here and do all these pads. All the way down to the end. Do all the traces. There we go. Okay, so that didn't take too long to tin. It's because we have to punch little holes or drill holes through all of these little pads here, you don't want to leave a lot of solder on them. But these bigger pads here where we're going to mount the surface mount components, it's okay to leave a little extra solder on there. So I've got my surface mount board and I've placed my header pins in, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to solder all the header pins in first because they're going to take the most amount of solder, so they're going to heat up pretty quick, and I don't want the solder flowing from my surface mount parts to my pin if I solder them later. So make sure you have a clean tip. And some solder, so put a little solder on your tip and then heat up the pad and the pin. Bring the solder in, make sure that it flows all the way around the pin and the pad. And don't do every single pin in a row. Leave a space, because when you look at these, they're held together with plastic, and if you overheat this pin and then the next pin beside it, the heat from both of them could melt your plastic. So you want to do every other pin and then come back and finish the ones in between. So once you have those all soldered in, make sure that there are no solder bridges between any of these pads here, because then you'll short out your LED and it won't work. Okay, so I'm going to start with the surface mount resistors. Be careful when you're taking this plastic off, because you don't want to drop your little resistors all over the floor. They're fairly sturdy little guys, but okay, so you can see I'm peeling the plastic off. One just flopped out. There we go. Now when you look at these, you can see that they're white on one side and they're black with numbers on the other side. It doesn't mean they all come this way. Some are black on both sides. It's going to be fairly hard to get these on, so you're going to need a small pair of needle nose, and make sure you keep all your little resistors in a pile together. They have a tendency to kind of run away on you. And you can see that the small ones have to be placed quite delicately across these pads. So this one has a number on it. It's 201, so that's 200 ohms. You want to get them fairly straight when you put them on. So you can see it just takes a little bit to move them. So it's going to be fairly tricky to get them all lined up like so. The method that I use for soldering surface mount resistors is to put a little bit extra solder on the pad first, and then bring in the resistor, and then reheat the pad and let the resistor kind of soak into the solder. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that right now. So with a clean tip, what I do is I add a little bit of solder to the tip, and then I bring the tip into the pad and just put a little bit of extra solder on the pad. Then I need to bring in my little surface mount resistor. So I pick that up. And this is a little bit tricky to do because you kind of want to get it centered on the pad. So then you want to reheat the pad. And then if the needle nose will okay, so you can see that that's a fairly sloppy solder job there. Now if you've got a long fingernail, you might be able to do it better. So I can reheat the pad. Just move the little guy over a little bit. There we go. So it seems to work a little bit better with a long fingernail. I'm still not happy with the placement, so I'm just gonna reheat it and move it over a little bit. There we go. Okay, so the first time you try this, it's going to take a few goes at it before you have something that looks fairly decent. Now keep in mind I've only soldered in one side of the resistor, so now I've got to solder the other side of the resistor. So to do that, once again clean your tip, add a little bit of solder to the tip, and then add a little bit of solder to the pad and the pin, like so. Now don't hang around heating this pad too much, because you see all this solder that was on the pin to the header? If you keep heating and heating this, eventually this solder is going to creep down and just flow right over your resistor. So you need to be careful there. So I've soldered on each of the resistors, and you'll notice that they're all oriented so they all say 201, 201, 201, 201, so they all read the same way, going right the way down the row. So the next thing I need to do is to put on these little LEDs, and they're actually called Gullwing LEDs. So I'll try and get those out the package next. And they come out just a little bit easier. Whoops, there went one flying. So you got to be very, very careful when you pull this off that they don't go flying all over the place. So there it is, a whole bunch of them just flew. Okay, so I don't know if you can actually see it or not here, but you can see when you take a close-up look of these things, they actually have little legs that come out and go down. And one side of the LED, right, it has this little bump in the center, and one side has no little ledge on it, and the other side has a little ledge on it. So the side without the little ledge, and it's very hard to see looking at it, but if you run your fingernail down the edge, right, it'll go over the bump and then straight down to the metal, and on the other side it'll go over the bump and sit on a ledge. So if you got a long fingernail, it's really helpful for this. So the side where the fingernail goes straight down and hits the metal, okay, that side is the cathode. Okay, so that is the negative side, so the other side is the positive side. Now, looking at the part layout that I gave you, you can see I put the diode in here, and there's a little bump going down this way. So this was originally designed for putting the surface mount board standing up on top of the SumoBot. So if you're going to stick it underneath, okay, obviously you're going to have to rotate it all the way around, and now instead of the bump being closest to here, right, so instead of the bump being closest to the header pins, okay, now the bump has to be further away on the other end, right, because this is the negative of the LED, so that's the positive of the LED. So the positive would have come in, gone through the resistor, positive our surface mount LED, and then back out. So what we're going to do is when we flip this board over, it now comes in this way. So this has to be turned around the other way. So I put these little Gullwing LEDs on the same way I do the surface mount resistors. The only problem is that when you heat up this pad to put the solder on, it's going to have a tendency, if you stay there too long, it's going to have a tendency to suck the solder from the resistor. So you're going to have to be very careful when you do this. So I'm going to start by cleaning my tip, put a little bit of solder on the end of my tip, and then a little bit of solder on the pad. Okay. So I've got my LED such that the bump is towards the bottom edge of the circuit board. So I'm going to bring in my LED and just touch it to the pad, then bring in my soldering iron and heat it up, and you don't want to stay there too long. Then you got to sit and look at it and say, did I get it straight? And I can see that I didn't, so I'm going to heat it up and move it with my nail. Now I can see that it's crooked, so I'm going to try again. And now I've moved it too far down, so I got to move it back up. And now it's crooked again. And now it's too far down. And now it's almost right. It's just a little bit crooked. So I'm going to hold it down with my fingernail and just move it a little bit. And now it's off the pad, so I'm going to bring it back and slide it back onto the pad. There we go. So once you're happy with the alignment of your LED, you can come in on the other side and bring in your soldering iron, put a little bit of solder on there, heat up the pad and the pin, bring a little extra solder, and just solder the other side into place. It's going to take a few attempts for you to get it perfectly squared up. Once you've got the technique down, the others should go in fairly quickly. Now when you take a look at your finished board, you'll probably see some brown burnt flux on there. Flux is conductive, so you do need to use some heavy-duty flux remover on there and just kind of spray it on. And then use a fairly stiff brush just to get it off of there. Okay, now would be a good time to test your circuit board. So we said that we were going to have a positive come in on the first line, go through the LED and then out the resistor. So I'm going to set up my power supply for about 4 volts, and I'm going to put the positive on the first pin and the ground on the second pin, and you can see the first LED lights up, and then you can just go down checking each LED as you go. Okay, so now they're all working.